Hello, and welcome to Let's Talk About Wargaming, a podcast where we talk about wargaming. I'm Jack, and with me today, always, is Joe. Say hi, Joe.
Hi, everybody.
Thank you very much, Joe. And today we're going to be talking about a bit of a controversial topic, but one that I think is near and dear to my own and Joe's hearts. This is, I guess, the closest we're going to get to a very special episode. Like, you know, the sitcoms where they're just like, we're going to address this serious topic about gun violence here on Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, or whatever, you know. Because today we're going to talk about the Clean Wehrmacht theory, and that's a whole interesting and fun can of worms to explore. For those of you who don't know what I do when I'm not sitting here recording the podcast or doing my day job, I am also a freelance writer for a few different sites, and something I did recently was a review for this game, Strategic Mind Blitzkrieg. And I mentioned that this game kind of fell into the realm of the Clean Wehrmacht theory, and I'll explain more about what that is in a minute, but suffice to say that I wrote about it, and I didn't think it would be, well, I knew it was going to be controversial, but it actually drew some fire for me specifically, and I was kind of surprised to see that. And so instead of backing off like they want me to, I've decided, hey, I'm going to double down and make a podcast episode about it. And with me here, as always, is Joe.
Yeah, and I think this is a good opportunity to address not just that specific case in that one game, although it's a very interesting one because of how the devs and the fans of that game series responded to the review, but more so because this is an ongoing and enduring topic within tabletop and PC wargaming. The idea of moralizing the factions, armies, generals that we are taking control over when we play a game, and whether or not that belongs in wargaming, or how we understand our relationship with the armies we're portraying. So it's a wider issue, and one that's been around for years. But I think now in 2020, especially in the context of the United States, it's more relevant than ever. So yeah, that's why I'm on board with this. I think it's a good thing to talk about.
Yeah, I myself am an American. Joe's Canadian, but as an American here in, we're recording this in September of 2020 for any future listeners who managed to dig this out of the rubble. And things are a little bit tense, I would say, in society in general. And one of the goals of what we're trying to do here today is to educate specifically on the topic of the Clean Wehrmacht theory and talk about why that matters. Because, you know, bottom line up front, the Clean Wehrmacht theory is basically whitewashing a lot of what the German military did during World War II and saying, no, they weren't that bad, which is problematic for several reasons. And we'll get into that. But it's relevant today because it's become a talking point for people who line up with the far-right ideologies, and it's kind of a slippery slope into that kind of thinking, is first saying, well, they weren't that bad. And we want to be here today to tell you that, no, they are in fact that bad. And, well, I don't want to get too worked up about this before we even start talking about it. The Clean Wehrmacht myth. So the German government during the Nazi government period from the 30s to 1945, is a fascist government. It's National Socialist. It's got a very strong militaristic control over everything, but it's not just the military that's controlling. It's paramilitaries working for the Nazi Party control a lot of the government. And there is a close relationship between the military and these paramilitary organizations. The paramilitaries, are like the SS, the Gestapo, these other organizations that specifically enacted order and violence in Nazi Germany against, the enemies of the government, which is, anyone from someone who's of the wrong ethnicity, religion, to political dissidents. So, it's a oppression on a wide scale are what these paramilitaries do. And the military, it's called the Wehrmacht, is what the German military was called at the time. They were not rounding people up inside of Germany. And I think that one of the reasons that things have gotten a bit confusing is because people are saying, oh, they weren't rounding people up and putting them in concentration camps in Germany, and therefore they were okay. They were just the military fighting for the government. Factually speaking, and with a lot of evidence, that isn't true. Because the Wehrmacht, when they went out and expanded the borders of Germany, invading into Poland, invading into the Soviet Union, invading into France, all across Europe, they did significantly collaborate with the internal forces that were committing these war crimes and genocides. And not only that, they didn't just collaborate, they went out and did them themselves. And there is a lot of evidence to show this, and we'll point to some pieces here in a little bit. But bottom line of this is that people want to say the Wehrmacht is absolved of any sins because they are just the military branch of the Nazi government, and we don't want to blame the military for the sins of the government. And they did 100% contribute to the various genocides and crimes against humanity that were done by the Nazi government.
Mm-hmm. And in some ways, you can see why that myth would come about, even without the concentrated effort to make that myth a reality in the 50s and 60s that I'm sure you're going to talk about in a second. But alongside the Wehrmacht out here doing this, there were dedicated groups like the Einsatzgruppen who were rounding up people and shooting them, and the SS. And it's easy at a glance to see these dedicated, groups of individuals and soldiers who were working specifically to eradicate, the unworthy or whatever, alongside the Wehrmacht, and think,
the
okay, cool.
Untermensch, I think, is the word they use for it.
Yes. And you can think that, well, see, they're separate. Like, these guys did this and the soldiers did this. And there's also that minute humanizing where you want to think, they can't all be bad guys. They're just, patriotic, doing their duty and all that. And for some individuals, the duped, tragically, that's the case. But there is a wide net that encompasses both people who follow the Nazi ideology and then people who signed up to fight in the Wehrmacht.
Right. And I think it needs to be stated that a lot of the people who were in the Wehrmacht were conscripted, especially towards the end of the war. They didn't volunteer to be there, but that doesn't mean that many of them aren't complicit in these war crimes.
Mm-hmm. The exploration of the changing ideology of the Wehrmacht throughout the war, as more and more people are being drafted into the organization, is worth its own study, if you're that interested. And it is important to note that when we get into these specifics, that there are some units within the Wehrmacht that are more aggressively enacting Nazi policies on the front line, others less so. So in some circumstances, you can see that, this company is responsible for this many crimes within this division, but the division next to it, for some reason, isn't. So it muddies the water, and it makes it trickier for people to come down without this sort of in-depth academic review of the sources and say, oh yeah, well, clearly this is the way it was. Like, we know that to be the case now. We know that there is a entrenched Nazism in the Wehrmacht and in all branches of Nazi military service, right? It's in the Luftwaffe, it's in the Kriegsmarine as well. It's in the oh god, my mind is failing.
It's in every branch of the military.
Mm-hmm. So I can see, and me being, I don't know, a nice guy trying to see the give the benefit of the doubt to individuals who may be on the fence about this, or who may have grown up with this idea that the Wehrmacht was apolitical and separate from the crimes of the Nazis, that there are many specific examples that someone could point to you to try and convince you in that direction. Unfortunately, those examples don't hold up beyond any scrutiny. And we've known this really since the late 70s, early 80s in academia, and especially since the mid to late 90s, when we started seeing a lot of German academics come out with these handfuls of evidence, for understanding the extent of Wehrmacht culpability in Nazi war crimes.
Yeah. So I think that what we want to do here is, well, first, I do want to say, neither Joe nor I think that, if you play as the Germans in a World War II game, you are a bad person, because that idea is ridiculous.
Oh yes, of course.
It's a video game. It's meant to be fun, and there's nothing wrong with playing as the Germans. I I really enjoy playing as the Germans in a lot of these World War II games. Hearts of Iron 4 and Company Heroes, I think, are probably the two I enjoy most playing as the Germans. I like them more than a lot of other factions in those games.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you're right. Like we talked about
Yeah.
this before. I have hundreds of dollars of pewter and plastic 44 Wehrmacht Pioneer platoons behind me for tabletop war games like Bolt Action and whatnot. And I picked them because I think it's interesting, and they're visually interesting, and the machinery is interesting, and the mechanics of the war is interesting.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, they are very interesting. The Wehrmacht is a very interesting topic, and it is a very interesting army to look at. It's really just fascinating, especially because of all the improvising and everything that they had to do. That being said, that doesn't make them good people. They are bad people. It is important that you remember this when playing these games, that you don't try to justify their existence because they are bad. It's like, I don't know, it's like playing the orcs in a Lord of
I
the
was just
Rings
thinking
game,
that.
or they are evil. There is not any
Mhm.
getting around it.
And that again is part of the difficulty of this topic when we talk about games specifically, like not just talking about Clean Wehrmacht myth in popular consciousness, but in games, is that if handled the wrong way, individuals might take this as a personal attack. Like, we're not saying you're a bad person if you play as the Germans in every game you play. That's fine. It's a war. It's not a great time regardless, right? But
Hmm.
that in itself leads into some difficulty with how games are presented and how game developers try to present to you the operational specifics of a conflict without miring you in the unpleasantness that is the actual war that's being fought. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't,
Right.
but the real issue we have are games that are actually going out of their way to present this myth to you, to cast the Wehrmacht as apolitical and clean, and in some dramatic cases, on the right side of history against the Nazis once they are,
Oops.
convinced of the wrongdoing of the leadership. But by then it's too late and it's all tragic and whatnot. And that is rough because, as we've talked about a couple times before on the show, we firmly believe that games are an important part of how people get their history these days. And more individuals are learning about specifics of military history through play. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it means there's more of a responsibility on developers and game writers to, handle these situations appropriately.
Right. And because we are history adjacent, a history wargaming adjacent podcast, that responsibility falls on us because no one else is doing it. I mean, I've known that some other areas try to cover it, but there isn't really a source across the medium for wargaming specifically that addresses this. So we're doing it, and that's great. So first, I want to specifically address an academic source that we're drawing a lot of this from. It's from Ben Shepard, wrote an article for historiographical reviews covering the Clean Wehrmacht theory, and it is a very interesting academic
Is that
source.
2004, 2006, something?
But
Yeah, it's good
I
to mid
think that's
2000s, so
right.
we know where the. Oh,
I think
perfect.
it's
Even
2009
better.
is what it says. Yeah, about 10 years ago, this article came out, and there's a lot of interesting information in there, but it completely debunks the Clean Wehrmacht theory. So if you have access to academic sources, I would recommend seeking this out. But the important thing to take away from this is the concept of Vernichtungskrieg, which is, I think I said that right, which is the War of Extermination thesis. And this is how the Wehrmacht operated early in the war. When the Wehrmacht was going into Eastern Europe, Southeastern Europe, to fight the Slavic peoples all across the area, it's important to remember that among all of the groups that the Nazis didn't like, Jewish people, Roma, anyone who basically wasn't a white straight person, basically, the Slavic people also fit into that box of people the Nazis did not like. And what the Nazis had wanted to do, why they invaded East in the first place, was for the concept of Lebensraum, which is a living room for the Germans because they felt they were getting too crowded in Germany, which is
Part of
absurd.
the
But
that's a
you know,
wide-ranging trend in late 19th century, early 20th century population history, right? That a lot of states were
yeah,
seeing their population growth as a zero-sum game. Right? If their population is growing and the space for people isn't growing, then this is going to be a problem. That's a part of the Malthusian concept
yeah,
of population growth, and we know that doesn't hold up now in modern scrutiny, but that was a big part of how a lot of states were thinking.
right. And so part of their thinking process of going out here is, oh, we're going to take over this land and get rid of the subhumans so that way good Germans can come in here and live here. This is
Yeah,
what they believed. And, part of the earlier Nazi thinking was, let's just deport these people. But then they attacked into the places they deported the people from. So they just started killing them. The same thing that they would do with other races they considered subhuman. There is a large amount of evidence to point towards the fact that the Wehrmacht in 1941 and 1942 in Eastern Europe was not their first order of battle wasn't just go and defeat the Soviets. It was go and exterminate the populace there. Not just kill everyone necessarily, but basically thin them out, cause chaos, cause terror, cause them to leave one way or another, in order to create this living space for the German people. It was one of their stated goals. And this is a very important thing to remember, is that they went out there with the intention to kill everyone, not just soldiers. But
and
it's it's not
it
great,
doesn't always
folks. It's
manifest
not
in like
great.
rounding her up and shooting them. A lot of it was food related, right?
Right.
Seizing all the food in area
Hmm.
and telling people to leave. And therefore they're left to their own
Yeah.
devices,
I,
which means if you're left to your own devices with no means to support yourself and no food, a lot of people are going to die, and a lot of people did die. And this is it's silly because they shot themselves in the foot in a lot of places where the local populace was not on the best terms with the Soviet government, and where they,
yeah. Ukraine, for example, they had just done the same exact thing with the
yeah, so
Holodomor
they
about 10
were
years ago.
they had a chance to make some friends, but that again went against the stated ideological reason for the acquisition of this space.
Right. Well, these people were subhuman. They weren't real people, Joe.
Oh, yes, my mistake.
So, yeah. So, so they would go into these places and deprive these people of the means to live, whether through outright killing them, denying them of resources, of food, shelter, etc. Um, just because they
It
didn't
was
want
only a
them
couple
there
years later
anymore.
when they actually started looking at these populations as potential slave labor, right?
I'm not sure of the timeline of using these populations as slave labor. I wouldn't be surprised if the second they got there, they at least conscripted some people to just do things for them. Although I don't know if it became
I'd have to
formalized
look
until
up
later.
something, but
I'm not
I'm
sure of the
pretty sure
timeline
the
on that.
actual it was a little bit like because at first they went in with that idea of just get rid of people and move on, right? You need to keep attacking, you need to keep pushing.
Right.
We'll deal with them with the people in the rear, and then the idea that we're going to need more labor came into it. In all cases, this is not good. But the
Right.
point is that people on the front lines, from the lowest to the highest here, are aware of the interactions they're having with the population. And yes, you can pull out of your butt half a dozen interactions that were pleasant because human beings are humans and we have to try very hard to make them hate each other. But by and large, this was an overwhelming issue. So if we're talking
Yeah.
about this, why did this even become an issue? Why did we have this idea that the Wehrmacht was apolitical besides the, inherent need to try and find good in ill? Was there a specific individual that we can point this to?
Before we jump into that, I want to point out real quick, by the way, um, even in places where the Nazis did not conduct the War of Extermination that they set out to do in Eastern Europe, in places such as France, Denmark, Norway, in the Western European countries, of these places that the Nazis considered more racially pure than the people in the East, they still did commit crimes against these people. And it's very important to point this out because even the people they thought that they saw of as more equal to themselves, I don't think they saw them as exact equals, but closer to the German ideal, they would still commit crimes against the populace in terms of summary execution of civilians, rape, theft, murder, just because they were in charge and they wanted to enforce their order. as a means of
Mm-hmm.
terror against the populace. It wasn't just in Eastern Europe, it was to everyone. And I mean, that's just how the German government operated. Back in Germany, they were executing non quote unquote subhuman Germans as well for disagreeing with the government even mildly could get you a bullet in the back of the head. And in these occupied places, it was much easier to die at the hands of the Germans, even if you weren't one of these subhuman groups in the eyes of the Germans or what have you, just because they're in charge and they can do what they want. But yes, where did the Clean Wehrmacht theory come from? Well, do we have someone specifically to blame for you? Isn't that wonderful? So, Franz Halder was the head of Oberkommando des Heers. That's German High Command during the war. So basically, one of the heads of the German military as a whole. Excuse me, I think it was just the army. I don't know if it was the whole military. But after the war, I think it was around 1948, he and a few other field marshals, Walter von Brauchitsch, I'm not sure how to say his name. I don't care. He's a Nazi. And Erich von Manstein, I know how to say his name at least. They drafted this paper called the General's Memorandum, also known as the German Army from 1920 to 1945. What this did was basically sanitize the German army in the interwar up to the post-war period for a few reasons, but the main reason was to essentially let themselves off the hook. One of the things that the Allied powers and the Soviets did around this time, and a lot of people don't know this, but we both the USSR and the US specifically ended up recruiting a lot of Nazis for various means. For example, there's a lot of famous records of the fact that the US brought in Nazi rocket scientists to help with NASA, and the Soviets did similar things, especially with helping them with the atom bomb and various regional government things for the Soviets after they formed the Eastern Bloc. But not just that. The outcome of this memorandum wasn't just to sanitize them for use by the Allies or the Soviets, but some of the German generals during the war, for example, ended up being rehabilitated and then put back into military command positions after the war, which is ludicrous. We have a few examples here.
Oh, I'm just saying, if you're a newly founded NATO and you want to know how to fight the Soviets in a land war in Europe because you're afraid that might actually be a possibility in the early 50s and then later on, who do you turn to? Who spent the past 5 years fighting the Soviets in a land war? Mm-hmm.
Right. But instead of just like asking for advice, they said, "Oh, here's your 4 stars. You're a general now in our new military. Congratulations, Mr. War Criminal. You've done it." So we have 3 examples here. There's far more than 3, but there's Hans Spiedel, former German general, was the first general of West Germany, and ended up being a commander in the regional forces at the time. Adolf Husinger, I think, chief of the General Staff of the Army in 1944. He ended up being chairman of the NATO Military Committee from 1961 to 1964. Chairman of the NATO Military Committee, the entire thing, for 3 years. Johann von Kielmansegg, General Staff Officer to Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the High Command of the Wehrmacht. He ended up being in charge of, I believe it was NATO units as well. I think he was actually part of the Bundeswehr, which is the West German self-defense force after the war. And it's just... these people committed war crimes. They oversaw war crimes. Thousands of the blood of, not to mention the fact that they lost the war and were working for Nazi Germany in the first place, but the blood of thousands of innocent non-combatants is collectively on all of these men's hands, and they got away with it. Partially because of the fact that they were sanitized to such an extent by the Allies and the Soviet Union in order to make use of these men, but also because they put this information out there themselves, and no one challenged them on it for
Morality
so long.
falls by
It's
the
absurd.
wayside in terms of pragmatism. often, right? There was a very real idea that the war would kick up again in Europe in the 50s and 60s, right? So I can see why, because you see it all the
Sure.
time. I don't agree, because you think there'd be some idea that we just spent this time winning this war against these people, that we shouldn't be giving them positions of power. But if you look at even the reconstruction of Japan in late 40s and early 50s, right? That government was entirely made up of basically rehabilitated members of the wartime government, because, well, they weren't communist, which meant that they were okay to be given power by the U.S. And you got the same thing here, right? They
Yeah.
decided that the greater of the two evils, the powers that be decided the greater two evils is communism, and we're going to do what we can to stop that. Which means a lot of these people who
Yeah.
should have been consigned to history when they lost their wars in 45, got to stick around in cushy office jobs for the next 20, 30 years, right?
Yeah. It continued serving in a position of power after this point is the important thing. It's crazy. And the thing is that they really didn't need these Nazis, like, because these are all Nazi Party members, regardless of how they personally felt about the Nazi Party. They were all members of the Nazi Party, and you know enacted war crimes. As I've pointed out, even if these men didn't personally go and shoot an innocent Russian in the back of the head or whatever, they were in charge of the people who did, and it is legally the responsibility of commanding officers to be responsible for the actions of their men in combat. They need to discipline them, and they need to issue justice when things like this happen. And this never happened with the Germans. There are extremely few cases, both with the German army and with the Japanese army, where commanding officers sought to stop their men from committing these crimes. There's one Japanese officer I don't remember the name of. He was a general early in the war that ended up being he ended up being executed after the war crimes, funnily enough. But he was one of the only generals that actually tried to stop his men from committing war crimes. Ended up failing in doing so, I think, because one of his subordinates kept doing it anyway. But the point is that surprisingly few people were actually brought to war crimes tribunals after the war. Very few of them actually saw justice, both with the Germans and Japanese. We're talking mostly about
Yeah,
the
in both
Germans here,
cases,
but it
you
wasn't
can
great for
go
either
digging
side.
into the Nuremberg trials and the Tokyo trials to see exactly how the victorious governments tried to come to terms with what they thought military law should be. And of course, the big deal is that they retroactively applied these new um, laws that were created during these trials to basically pin war crimes on certain individuals, right? And that's a very important part of why some of these people slipped through the cracks and others didn't, because it was politically expedient or not, but also was a very kind of ad hoc and slapped together legal issue in the first place. The Japanese case, especially, is very fraught with difficulty and like bad translations and just a mess. And yeah, there were a few commanders, high ranking commanders, who were hanged for the crimes of subordinates. And in a lot of cases, it was something that's prolific with the Japanese army in the war period, is that they just there was no proper command and control.
Mm-hmm. And I want to point out also is that it really wasn't necessary for these Nazis to be in positions of government after the war. There was a standing civil society in Germany that existed. It wasn't that long since the Weimar Republic had existed, and there were non Nazi officials or non party related officials that they could have tapped to help lead the new Germany. And they did, but they didn't lean on them enough to not use these people. And I don't see a reason why that had to be the
In my
case.
limited experience, ease. In the Japanese case, especially ease, and the
Well,
fact that
sure.
you have you know the potential for a fall to communism in these shattered societies after the war. So you do what you can to make sure that there are people in place who are firmly not following that ideology, and that plays into a lot of decision making all over the place. Tragically,
Right. Okay, well, I think we've talked long enough about the history of this. So let's talk a little bit about why this matters now and how we're seeing it now, because the Clean Wehrmacht theory is not gone by any means, because it is still propagated by a lot of different pieces of media. Um, but in terms of wargaming, we do have a few examples of this served up for you here. So something to keep in mind is that a lot of games and other pieces of media, like I said, do downplay the role of the Wehrmacht in war crimes for a few different reasons. One, it makes it easier to relate to the Wehrmacht characters and see them as good guys, uh, which is in the case of some games that want you to relate to them. It's
See,
it's
it's
not
tricky. Like
great.
I know why
I
you're
don't.
having some trouble trying to get this out because we're not we ourselves are riding a very thin line here. We're not trying to damn every single game that talks about the German perspective of the war. In fact, I encourage it. It's
Right.
just difficult when perhaps there's not the level of research or the level of care taken with the actual writing in a game that manages to do that without separating the individuals that they're highlighting from the reality of the situation they're in. So it's easy to write
Definitely.
a character, a German soldier character who is not a Nazi and is just swept along because then the player and the developer doesn't have to wrangle with these issues we're talking about. And they're tricky issues. What that means is if they do that poorly, you get, and I hate to bring it up again, but the tragedy of the Starny games, where being the nicest person we can be,
Yeah.
that even if they did not intend for this perspective, it is what emerges based on the writing and the characters that they create in their games. So that's why I think so often you see game companies who are dealing with these wars, especially war games where you're directly controlling, both sides or the bad guys in this case, that they just shy away from detailing that personal experience with the conflict at all. Like a lot of the games that are quite good, like Order of Battle and Panzer Corps and those ones, you're there and you're participating, but they don't dive into the personal.
Right. And what is happening in these games is that, it's hard to relate to a character that is of a regime like this. But what they're doing is making them good guys. They're not just making them, oh, it's a person caught in the circumstance. And it is hard to do that, but in the case of the Starny games, it seems to be Starny is the strategic mind series, by the way. They're just making them the good guys basically, and it's very strange. Like there are points where they'll stop and talk about their morals and their views of things, and it's like, oh, we're so much better than the Nazis, but they are Nazis. They're it's the Wehrmacht. They're committing war crimes. They're not absolved of guilt. Like I genuinely don't think there is a way that you can make a a staff level officer of the Wehrmacht a relatable character in these games, because it would just mean that you would have to ignore all of the things that they did, or all of the things that they implicitly approved of or allowed, just because in order to make them relatable, you will have to ignore the fact that they are responsible for genocide. There's no getting around that. I think that you could probably, uh, you know, lower level officers, NCOs, regular soldiers, you can relate to them because they've been caught up in the situation. They might have volunteered early on, not really understood what was going on, or they might have been conscripted. But I think it's easier to argue for that. Staff level officers, I don't think can be free from blame for these things, and I don't know if we can really say that they will be a good conduit to seeing into the eyes of the Wehrmacht and seeing them as humanized characters. Um,
Oh, sorry, I was just going to talk about how this comes up in other media because we were talking about games specifically, and that makes it difficult because
okay,
the player's in control, so you have to take that extra step there. But in films, yes,
I would have
okay.
mentioned one more game actually first. Sorry if that's all right. There is one other game that I think does the latter case well, because there is this game, not strategic mind. We just talked about that. It's decisive campaigns, Barbarossa, and this one is also kind of story
Mm.
driven, like strategic mind, but it is less so. And you are kind of role playing as a general level officer in this, and it's interesting because you basically have the ability to turn off the dirty aspects of the war, so you don't have to think about that, which is interesting. But the way that they humanize the characters for the Wehrmacht without making it too bad is that in one of the random units of your army, you will sometimes see letters from this soldier back to his parents back home, like this random private level soldier in the Wehrmacht. And the idea is that you perform well enough to make sure that this soldier survives, because if you do badly, he might end up dying in combat. And I think that that's an interesting way to humanize the various aspects of this, because you're seeing letters from this guy every few turns, but at the same time, you're getting direct dispatches from Hitler telling you to go, do your thing. And I think that that's a better way to go about relating to the Wehrmacht than, we're morally
So that
good and whatnot.
brings up a couple things. One, that the game has a "do you want to turn off the atrocities" button is an admission of atrocities in itself, and that's a good thing, right? We're not ignoring it, and we're not treating it like the problem of someone else. If you're turning off the atrocities, that means you can have them on. Now, I haven't played decisive campaigns, but the humanizing of individual soldiers on the ground, see, that again falls into that interesting trap of, yes, it's easier to see individuals, like low-level individuals, being swept along by this, but doesn't address that there were lots of Nazis in the low levels as well, right? And that's makes such a difficult thing to address here, because this is intensely personal. Any person has to know within their own heart when they're doing this if they're a true Nazi, or if they're doing it because they don't want their family back home to suffer or something. And that's a difficulty whenever we get to these regimes that take over their countries and enact these kinds of fascistic totalitarian ideologies, is that many people just don't want to die and don't want to be hurt and don't want their families to suffer, and will go along with it, because as long as they go along with it, then they're not going to be hurt. And that's a separate level from the diehards. Now, it doesn't mean they're innocent, because you can't be when you're involved with such a situation, but it is certainly a different level. And that is something that I think, in a game is practically impossible to deal with, because, well, you're, by nature of being a war game, you're dealing with the higher level stuff in the first place. Having letters, though, it is a nice way of, opening that up, but it's hard to say that's the okay way forward, given that it opens so many more cans of worms, doesn't it?
Right. I should clarify. I don't think it's the best way to do it, but it's a better way to do it than what the Sarni,
it is better than creating a
done.
fictional narrative in which the Wehrmacht is separate from the Nazis and actively opposes Nazi atrocities.
Yeah. Spoiler alert, I guess, if you want to go play Strategic Mind Blitzkrieg, don't do that. But if you were going to go play that, the main character for the game is you, as the avatar, are possessing Franz Halder, the aforementioned guy who wrote the frickin' memorandum on why the Wehrmacht was not bad during the war. And it's alternate history, and you beat the Soviet Union, and eventually you lead a democratic coup against Hitler, and he gives a speech at the end about why they're not bad.
Oh boy,
it's absurd. It's utterly insane. Oh yeah, no, at the end of the game, he gives a speech like, new democratic future for Germany, etc. We're going to undo many of the things done by Hitler, and we might even return some of the land that we have captured. It's funny because he says it like that exactly. He's like, we might even return some of the land we've annexed. And it's like,
man, they cranked it up to 11, didn't they?
What? Oh yeah, it's so crazy. I mean, I played this game, and after seeing that is what really drove me to become suddenly very passionate about this subject, because it's so insane. And people will play this and think, yes, that is how the Wehrmacht were. No, it isn't how the Wehrmacht were. This is all propaganda written by Franz Halder that's still affecting us 75 years later. It's insane.
That's insane.
It's utterly ridiculous.
To think all we had to do was let the Nazis win, and they would have just democratized and gained everything back, and the world would have been fine.
I know, and I don't know. It reminds me of, not to go off on a tangent here, but it reminds me of the reign of Augustus, the first Roman emperor, and how in all the sources he's shown to be, this very, very good emperor. He was one of the best ones, etc., etc. apparently what he had done is just hired so many propagandists and writers at the time to just write up how awesome he was. And what historians now are thinking is that most of the surviving sources from the time were sources paid by Augustus to make him look super cool and good. And it's kind of like that, but this was 75 years ago, and there's people alive now who still remember this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, I don't know. There's people who deny the Holocaust still with all the evidence out there. I'll post a couple links in the description for this episode about if you think the Holocaust didn't happen, why you're stupid and wrong. I'm not going to mince words about it. You're very dumb and wrong if you think the Holocaust didn't happen. But I'll post links in here if you want to educate your friends that don't know. Because apparently I saw this the other day, like about 20% to a third of young Americans do not either know about the Holocaust, don't think it happened, or don't think it happened to the extent that it did, which is horrifying.
Remember, liberal education is not worth the budget.
Uh,
If only we had decades of scholars talking about how this would be the end result of not funding and not holding liberal education in the United States to high regard.
Yeah.
But anywho,
not to always make fun of Francis Fukuyama, but you didn't see this one coming, bud, did you?
the poor man has had enough of a beating.
I know. He's moved away from it, and he's like said it, but it's so easy to make fun of. Gotta get a shot in every now and again.
Okay, so should we lead this into then games and the morality of playing games? Because this has been a topic for years. Oh no, I want to add one more point to this because we're talking about Starny games. We're talking about that particular Blitzkrieg game. 2 years ago, in 2018, the second ever article I wrote for Wargamer.com was a review for Panzer Strategy, their first game. I too wrote in that review that they were pushing a Clean Wehrmacht myth, because they were in their shitty cutscenes and their shitty dialogue. They were 100% pushing the Clean Wehrmacht. It's bad. I did not get a peep of dissent in that review. Nobody cared about that review. No one thought I was being absurd. In 2020, your review saying the same thing a bit more passionately, I will admit. You say it a bit more forcefully than I did.
I'm a very passionate and forceful person.
And that's fine. But people went nuts on the comments of that review.
Oh yeah, there were a bunch of comments on the review, and people were disagreeing with me very vehemently about my thinking of the Clean Wehrmacht as a topic and how it could relate to current events. Because I said it was tone deaf, because I said, hey, Starny, look at what's happening right now, and you're kind of contributing to a certain narrative inadvertently, perhaps, inadvertently, definitely. I don't want to say that Starny is trying to fuel any kind of ideology.
It does seem to be coming from a place of ignorance.
It is coming from a place of ignorance. I am not going to say that Starny Games is willfully malicious or anything like that. I don't think that they're bad people. I do, however, think that they are tone deaf, like I said. And there were a lot of people in the comments who were very mad at me, to the point that someone reached out to the developers to issue a statement about it. And that was very interesting. So there's that. That didn't happen when Joe posted a similar piece 2 years ago.
Yeah.
So that was fun.
In fairness to Starny, their stated opinions that they're not Nazis, they don't believe this, and they did not intend to push a Clean Wehrmacht myth.
That right. And I don't want to blame them too heavily. Like, they did make this game, and it is, I would say, reinforcing this narrative. I don't think it's intentional, but that doesn't change the fact that they did do it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to blame Starny for any of this. They're a Ukrainian developer. By all means, most people would probably know what harm the Nazis and the Wehrmacht can do to a place, as they were one of the countries that were run over by them first.
All the more reason they should have put more effort into the writing and into the research behind how they chose to do this game.
Yeah.
Yes.
Anyway, I just got an offer in my email. Looks like Starny wants to hire me as a writer.
Take it.
Yeah.
It'll be a force for good. But but the whole, leading this back around to wargaming in general and to concepts of morality in gaming. I don't know how up you are on trends in board games like wider board games, not even
I
just.
am much not as up. I think you're far more into the board game community than I am, Joe.
Okay, so a consistent issue is ideas of representation and ideas of uh, themes which should not or could not be played in board games. And colonialism is the one that comes up a lot.
Mm.
Idea that we shouldn't be playing games where you players through their avatars are exploiting people in any way, shape, or form.
I remember you played, what was it? The board game where you colonize. You're either England or France, and you played this recently. I remember seeing your review on it.
That's Twilight's, not Twilight Struggle. That's the Imperial Struggle. Imperial Struggle
Okay.
is that one, and yeah, that was something I brought up in the game review, because the game itself firmly places the two players as England and France as the only active agents on the planet. And you are pushing and pulling other countries, nations, peoples in India, in America, in Latin America, like the Caribbean, and in Europe for your gain. And I was okay with that because that was the point of the game. The point of the game was these two empires treating others as pawns for their own, imperial struggle. Thus the game. And the fact that these people were not complacent and were not passive agents in these historical events is reflected in certain cards and certain random occurrences in the game where they disrupt your plans. But the point of the game is that you are seeing this skewed version of history, right? You're seeing history through the lens of these two governments who are viewing it as this, you know,
Game.
dual this game for empire, but this two-player game. you know Spain is a token to be won over for military support on the continent, and that's fine because that's the theme of the game. So personally, as a person who thinks that history and gaming should be better merged because gaming can be a very personal way to experience history, I have no problem with games about colonialism. The problem is the same with games that deal with the Clean Wehrmacht myth. If we are pushing a game that is colonialism, where all you see are European powers going to the New World and bringing happiness and joy and civilization to the stupid barbarians, then I got a problem with that, because that is not accurately representing the history as we see it, nor is it commenting on the issues with how these empires saw their own expansion and their own imperialism. Imperial
Right.
struggle is unique because it's almost played as a joke. Like you see the world being pawned back and forth by these two powers, and it's absurd. And that's part of the humor of it. Same with the game's predecessor, Twilight Struggle, which is a Cold War game. You see the US and the USSR doing the same thing, pushing and pulling all over the planet, and literally instigating coups in the Middle East just to peeve off the Russians and get +1 victory point. And it's part of the absurdity of this kind of high level game. So I have no problem with games of colonialism. The issue, I think, extends to war games dealing with unpleasant wars or wars with unpleasant outcomes. If you're playing, a battle for Moscow, and you're playing as the Germans, and then you win and take over Moscow, that's going to end badly for the Slavic people that live in the former Soviet Union. That doesn't mean you're a Nazi, but it means you have to understand the ramifications of the conflict you're fighting.
Yeah. It's a it's a strange thing because we said this before in the Sino-Japanese War episode, but as someone who's playing a war game, you don't want to acknowledge the fact that your people, when you win, are committing genocide,
Mhm.
which is why a lot of games just don't talk about it at all.
Yeah,
And I think to an extent that's fine, as long as it doesn't try to clean up or justify the actions of your people. Like, I think Hearts of Iron 4 is probably the base example of this, because in Hearts of Iron 4, you can play as Nazi Germany, for example, and you are like, your leader is Hitler and whatnot, and you can go and take over these places, but there's no reference to the Holocaust, no reference to, people quote unquote worse than the Germans, and there's no reference to a genocide or doing horrible things to the civilians at all. The closest you get is what kind of law you decide to enact on the places you've conquered. How strict do you want your garrisoning forces to be? That is the closest you get to an acknowledgement of what German occupation would look like, what the horrors of the German war machine and government in general enacted on people.
Hmm.
And I think it's okay-ish. I I don't know of a better way to go about it. They didn't want to address it, and I understand that coming from a player's perspective, because if I, for example, wanted to play as Nazi Germany in this game and like, oh, let me go see if I can beat up the Russians, I don't want to think about the fact that I am helping them, exterminate races of people. Like, it would suck. I wouldn't want to play as the Germans.
For myself, there's almost like a three-tier thing here, where you have games on the bad end, the ones that are actively pushing for a historically false narrative, whether or not, intentionally or not, and that's the worst. Then in the middle are the games that choose to not acknowledge it, and that's where the grand majority of them lie, right? Because of that reason, you don't want to make
Right.
players feel bad. You want people to enjoy your game, so you just don't touch on it. You focus on the operational, you focus on the tactical, and you ignore it. And then there are some games that try to be very involved with that kind of decision making for educational purposes, and they generally tend to be smaller, more niche games, or games that explicitly set out to deal with that. I also just reviewed recently Cauldrons of War Barbarossa, which is a one-man indie game where you are fighting one side or the other of the war in the East, and you are actively forced to make decisions about the atrocities that the Wehrmacht is carrying out, and then the atrocities that they're allowing to be carried out by the Einsatzgruppen and the SS who are following them, and the local militias and people in the places they're liberating who are performing their own programs, which of course happened. And
Yeah.
that's a fascinating way of dealing with it, because in that game you're either following the party line, in which case you're not being hindered in any way, shape, or form as you push forward, but you're committing these atrocities. And then if you try to uh, hold back, you start seeing the rest of the high command get upset with you, and it start affecting your supplies. Because if you, for example, you want to feed the Russian prisoners that you have, which was a historical issue, it's going to come out of your food, because at that point they were running out of food themselves. So where's the food going to go? It's if you're going to give it to the prisoners too, then everyone's going hungry, and that's of course a big issue. So in the game, there's a binary, or a single number called barbarism, barbary, I forget, that ticks up the more atrocities you commit, and this just affects Soviet morale. So the more barbarism, the higher the Soviet morale, the less likely the divisions are to break. The other side of that is hindering your army to try and slow the growth of barbarism, and to see the other generals getting more and more terse with you as the war goes on, because you're not committed, you're being weak. And I like that they actually went and did that. Going back to that middle group, that one is where I think see most games going, and I understand it, but it also breeds some of its own like particular unique issues, like Hearts
Hmm.
of Iron. And we talked about this before the podcast, and there have been academic studies on it, that these kinds of sandbox games where you can take the Nazis and run with them tend to breed a unique community of alt-right fascist type players, like a niche within a niche within a niche within a niche here. And
Yeah.
that's something that the game companies themselves have to try and take active measures to stop, and the communities try and police themselves. But that's a
Well,
big issue.
should.
Yes, they
Should, I
definitely
think,
should.
is the operative word, because they don't always.
Yeah, you had some examples, right? Do you want to share them?
Yeah. So what I've been playing a lot of recently is a mod for Hearts of Iron 4 called The New Order, TNO. It's an alternate history mod that takes place in the 1960s. And basically, the idea is the Germans won the war, and things suck all over. And so fascism is rampant across most of Europe and Africa and a lot of Asia as well. And apparently, from what I had heard, I only recently started playing this, but from what I heard from people who are more involved in the community than I am, is that the moderators for the subreddit for this mod and for their Discord had to just ban a bunch of Nazis because they were playing it as some sort of like kind of crazy like fantasy fulfillment thing. Like, oh, wouldn't this have been great? And like, I don't know, it in a game like this is just like, oh yeah, these people are terrible, but this is like a fake made up fantasy world because it didn't happen. But some of them were playing it because they had wanted that to happen, and that's terrifying.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not a unique circumstance.
No, the articles I was reading talked about communities like this occurring in Hearts of Iron 2 and 3. I think the big one was Bulgarian community that made its own mod where Bulgaria took over, and they were using it as like a front for their, you know, the Bulgarian political alt right groups. And it's fascinating that this is, you know,
Bulgarian nationalism.
yes, sorry, they would come together in a game forum to talk about this game and to talk about what should have happened in Bulgaria's past, like the robbed glory of a Bulgaria that lost World War II. You know,
It's crazy, uh, and I want to point out that these sorts of things, these sorts of communities, don't just spring up among these specific games. Like, I mean, anyone who's listening to this, if you have played a game online, you have heard someone who is a Nazi or perhaps alt-right adjacent in some way or another. You know, you're playing Call of Duty, someone calls you the N-word, or you know, you go into a an in-game forum, you're playing an MMO, especially one of the ones that isn't as moderated as well, like back in the day, like RuneScape or whatever, and you will see horrible vitriols just spewed from there, like horrible things about people. And I don't know, for example, I think perhaps the best example of this that I can think of is Wargame. So the series called Wargame, they, when you log into like Wargame Red Dragon, for example, that's the most recent one, there is a general chat that everyone who is playing the game can type in, and I have seen some of the worst things I have seen online typed in that chat outside of like 4chan, when I used to look at 4chan like years ago. And these communities exist and they radicalize people. I don't know how else to say this, but these people existing and in a loud enough manner, even if there's not a lot of them, if they exist in a loud enough manner, they will be accepted by people who are impressionable, or they will have a way in to people who they could convince that they are correct. This thing is not an unfamiliar phenomenon to people of myself and Joe's age. I mean, you and I think both probably grew up on the internet, where, you know, only a few years apart,
mm-hmm.
removed in terms of age. But I don't know about you, Joe, but I have 100% known people who fell victim to alt-right slash Nazi slash fascist propaganda and are now just spewing hatred online. And one of the ways that this starts is through just having exposure to it and it not being challenged constantly and aggressively, because that's how this needs to be challenged. And one of the ways that you can be exposed to it is, oh, hey, I'm playing an online game. Oh, this guy over here is talking about the Nazis weren't that bad, or the Wehrmacht specifically wasn't that bad, to loop it back around. This happens. We have seen it happen. It happens in online games, and without people to tell, you know, for example, an impressionable young person, like a 13-year-old kid playing this game, like, to remind them from a position of authority, like, this isn't okay, or to fight back against the people who are saying that by banning them or whatever. There's a pipeline. There's a pipeline that exists that can radicalize these people and turn them into people who think that the Nazis were okay. You can say that I'm crazy about this if you are probably an older person who is listening to this that isn't as experienced with this sort of thing. But there are studies, there's articles, there's proof that this is how this happens. I've seen it firsthand. Joe, I don't know if you have.
The amount of vitriol I've seen in lobbies for specifically multiplayer historically themed games is pretty extreme. I'm talking about playing Mountain Blade and Mountain Blade Napoleon online.
Mountain Blade specifically
Yeah,
is rough.
because Mountain Blade, you
I
can pick, the different factions are the different Napoleonic military,
mhm.
and they're along national lines, and the amount of nationalistic hooah that people are throwing around that game is frightening.
It is frightening. The Mountain Blade community does have a lot of racism in it, much like a lot of other multiplayer games. It's gotten to the point where, specifically to troll these people back, when I play these games, and I'm really good at Mountain Blade, and so when I kill someone that's like Hitler Lover 69 or whatever their name is in the game, I will type in the chat, "I'm gay and better than you," because I am, and I am better than you. So suck it, Nazi. Yeah, because like all I can do is just troll these guys and make them mad at me because I have to remind them they're not superior. They are inferior because they suck.
Look at you invading their safe space. But
I
that's
am going into the Nazi safe space. I'm going into their war games and being all, I don't know, the entire LGBT spectrum at once.
see, and this is a problem also with I found it personally, and this is anecdotal again, in playing games where you see Imperial Japan in World War
Oh
II,
yeah,
or is it Rising Storm? They have Rising Storm 2,
Rising Storm is the one where it's got the Americans and the
and the Japanese, yep,
Japanese.
and then Rising Storm
Yeah,
2
it
in
was based on the
Vietnam.
Red Orchestra engine,
Hmm.
which
And
already kind of had some problems in itself because it was the Germans and the Soviets.
but in the case I'm more familiar with, there is endless racist jokes oriented at the Japanese and oriented at the Vietnamese, and all kinds of slurs because I don't know, people want to be role playing or some stupid shit. But it's a free space where they get to act like a racist and no one's going to call them out on it because it's a game where they're a lot of the people playing it are like that, and the people who don't do that just mute them anyways and aren't privy to it. That's what I ended up doing.
Yeah.
You just mute them and keep playing the game because you want to play the
It's
game.
easy to think that it's not like serious because you are just playing a game and it's like, oh, there's a person online who's saying some nasty stuff. I can just mute them.
Yeah,
That is like the thought process behind this.
that's what I do because I still want to play these games, and I just don't engage with the. I haven't spoken to a teammate in a tactical game. Sorry, all my teammates in tactical games, in 5 years because I just don't like to talk to people.
I haven't played many of those games recently. Partially, one of the reasons was I did get banned from a couple servers because I would hear people saying racist stuff and I would go over and team kill them.
Again, you're invading their safe space. What are you doing?
Yeah, I was playing Squad a couple months ago. The
Yes.
online yeah, it's kind of like Battlefield, and it's really funny because there were people in the lobby who had very racist names when I joined, and I joined and created a squad, and I was like, okay, well, I guess we'll see what happens when I do this, and I named my squad Antifa Super Soldiers because I thought that was funny, and it is funny in my opinion. And I got banned. I got banned from the server. I didn't do anything else. I had to go appeal to the moderators to let me back in order to try to like play with my friends I was playing with that night. And yeah, that was it was wild. And I talked to some people in another Discord server about that. And I I told them like, hey, this happened. Isn't that crazy? And just luckily, one of the people I was talking to was a moderator for the subreddit for the whole game. They're like, oh, okay, we're just gonna ban this guy from the subreddit. That was the mod that banned me from the game. So it became this whole thing.
Hmm.
But like, I don't know. That's just a recent experience of something like this happening to me. Is that they completely ignored the people that had like N word in their name or like Nazi or whatever, or like 1488. You know the
Yeah.
famous 14 words, and 88 is Heil Hitler because Nazis are so dumb.
Yes.
And like people these in their names, and they were in there, they were fine, they were like typing in the chat like, oh, slur, and they were fine. But I show up and I'm like, okay, I hate Nazis basically, and they kicked me.
So
So
that wraps around nicely to I suppose the point we were trying to make with this entire podcast is that while game developers and people who are running these games may not intend for this type of experience, this type of version of history to become predominant within their production, it can happen because people who want to find a place where they can freely push these things or want to find some sort of kindred spirit will flock to this type of game. And if it's not being regulated, that's a problem. So in the case of war games that are actively pushing for these myths around this, the quality, moral quality of the Wehrmacht, if we want to call it that, it becomes an issue today when these are very much things that we are debating again for wholly unpleasant reasons. And gaming as a less regulated space becomes some place that people can find their safe space, to use the pejorative, right? And that's an issue.
yeah, a lot of these people want to use gaming as their safe space for people like them, and it's a thing that you can see in other communities. For example, like the sports or geek culture specifically. Like 10-15 years ago, people were like, oh, girls can't like comics or whatever because they're girls or something. I don't know. I never really understood the logic behind it, but
It's just
there's a lot
exclusionary.
of
That's all. People want to
Mhm.
feel like they have
Yeah,
control over their own space, and if they,
like
open up, it's a
this is my
problem.
thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, like this is my thing. You can't have it because this is mine.
Hmm.
And we've seen like that recede from places like geek culture or whatever, and I feel like in a way that's kind of radicalized further these communities of people
Hmm.
because they got pushed out of like geek culture, they got pushed out of sports. Um,
Yep.
and now they don't have so many hobbies that are just theirs left. I mean, for example, like tabletop role-playing games, D&D is like super popular right now, and that used to be the height of like nerddom
See,
is D&D.
actually, that segues back into the board game thing and the whole culture thing we're talking about. That like the issues that people are taking with games dealing with colonialism or games portraying war and games portraying Nazis. Uh, it's a good discussion to be having, and I'm glad that we're having it. I'm glad that people are coming out and saying, I don't feel represented in this hobby, and that we need to deal with it. And that happened with geek culture, like you said, 10 years ago, or 5 years ago, whatever, and is
Mhm.
now starting to happen in the world of wargaming and the world of tabletop gaming. Right, we're seeing a re-examination of how players interact with the worlds, the fictions that they engage in with tabletop games and with board games and with PC gaming or video gaming in general. And that means that wargaming becomes, one of the few spaces because of its niche, niche, what do you call it? Niche hood that,
Nicheness,
yeah, it's nicheness,
nichosity.
that those groups that once felt safe to be hateful in the wider geek community are being pulled further and further and further back. And then when we have people who think wargaming is their last, safe vestige of enjoying a hobby without, air quotes, politics in it. There's always politics in everything. That's how politics works.
War is politics by any other means,
Oh,
said
oh,
Clausewitz.
don't go throw. Oh, you're gonna make them have a fit.
Famous Prussian who they love to worship.
Do you think
Karl von Clausewitz said that war is politics by any other means. So, there's that.
if I didn't have to sit down and read Clausewitz, I wouldn't have. So I really doubt they're reading him.
I don't know. I know that people are forced to read him, like people who are
Yeah.
in the military or whatever. And some people just love to idolize the Prussian military structure because I guess the Germans aped so much from it. It's just like Nazi fan fiction almost, but like written before the Nazis were a thing.
It's hundreds of
Not that
pages.
not that I think that Clausewitz was a Nazi,
No.
but they love him.
Yeah, no, Clausewitz, that's a different time with a different issue, of course.
That would be a hell of a take if we were just like, yeah, Karl von Clausewitz, famous man in the 1800s, was a Nazi.
That's where we're gonna.
Please don't clip that. That is not my opinion.
Let's not. We can do a Napoleonic episode later, and we can dig up some fun stuff. And we can talk about lessons in military changes in the Napoleonic era. But back to my point being that when you have your article about this game, and when you have the issue with, I think it was back in April or May, when Black Lives Matter was becoming a very important byword for a lot of people, a lot of companies,
Right.
and war game companies, specific war game like tabletop, hex and shit, traditional war game companies were being called upon to make a statement, and then some of them did. They received horrendous backlash from their community. Multi-Man Publishing was one. I have a few other games. I've reviewed a couple other games. I generally like the stuff they put out. They were quiet for a while, and then they came out in support of Black Lives Matters, and their Twitter posts were just full of the most hateful stuff from their followers, right, from their customers. Everyone's saying they're not going to buy from them ever again, or how dare they do this, or now they can't make a Civil War game anymore, can they? Like the some sort of gotcha. And the ever prescient go woke, go broke, which I just, yeah. So that happened. It happened to GMT games as well. And then we see certain game companies like, what did they do? I
Lock
reviewed,
and Load,
yes,
wasn't it?
Lock and Load, thank you. I reviewed two of their games, and I won't be playing anymore, who came out specifically against Black Lives Matters and the idea that everyone is created equal. So you see how this is still a niche part of the gaming world where these seeds can be sown and cultivated. And games that don't address these issues, but skirt them, or worse, ignore them, or push the opposite, the Clean Wehrmacht side of things, can be a major issue, because this is still a place where people who identify with that and ignore history come to feel good about themselves. And we need to do in wargaming what we've done in tabletop gaming, what we've done in geek culture in general, and tell them that that's not all right.
Yeah. If there is a key takeaway for you to take from this episode, other than learning about what the Clean Wehrmacht is that I personally, I don't want to say this for Joe, am going to make it my stated mission to make wargaming as unpleasant a community for Nazis as possible.
Oh yeah, there's
I
nothing wrong with that. I'm with you there. I've already tried to comment on, my tiny voice on Twitter screaming into the void about the issues in wargaming and the issues with
yeah.
wargaming as this, last refuge for the Nazi.
Yeah.
And
I
that's not
can't think
fair.
of what else they like at this point, because this seems like it, because you get this community of very, I mean, let's be honest, the wargaming community is predominantly a very white male straight community, and any challenge to that they do not like, and any challenge to the status quo of, hey, perhaps we shouldn't be pushing the Clean Wehrmacht theory, is met with hatred. Sometimes it's out of, well, hatred and ignorance. I don't want to say it's all hatred, but
Yeah,
it's
what's the
it's bad.
I want to look this up because it's important. Oh yeah, War Games, Soldiers, and Strategy. They do tabletop miniature war games, but
Okay.
every year they put out a something called the Great Wargaming Survey, and they try and spread it far and wide, PC gaming, tabletop gaming, miniature gaming, just to get a read on the people who are playing. And the data there is fascinating. And they try and look at the data. They have some statisticians, talk through some of it. And the numbers of like women playing tabletop miniature wargaming or involved in wargaming at all is still microscopic, but slowly rising. And if you look at channels like Little Wars TV, they actually interviewed female tabletop wargamers to ask them about their experiences in the hobby. And it's the kind of stuff that we would expect from general geek culture 10, 15 years ago, where they would show up ready to play these, hardcore military tabletop war games and be, like mansplained the rules, even though they've done the rules. And one woman
Yeah.
illustrated the uniforms for the 7 Years' War. She had like an encyclopedic knowledge of all this, and she had guys at the table trying to tell her who was who. I mean, she literally wrote the book, but that's just the way the community is still acting, right? So
Yeah.
we need to, we can see places trying to push the envelope here, trying to break down this final barrier. But I think, like you said, a good takeaway for this episode is that this could be your call to action, right? If you're a wargamer, try to make it more inclusive. Try to educate about the conflicts that you're wargaming. You don't have to feel guilty if you play as the Waffen SS in the Eastern Front, because that's still a legitimate way to experience these games. You don't have to feel bad if you're playing a game about colonialism, but you need to be educated. You need to make sure that the way that you're experiencing this or the way that you're sharing this with other people is reflective of the history that's happening and doesn't sell any unpleasant, incorrect myths about how these wars, how these conflicts, how these uh, imperial endeavors actually affected human beings. Because we're playing with history, we're
Right.
playing with humans.
At the end of the day, Joe and I both love wargaming, and we want this to be a community where people feel welcome enjoying their hobby, and we want people to feel welcome in here. I mean, one of the reasons that we don't see a lot of women or other groups playing war games is because they're not welcome here. And I think that wargaming is a very interesting and great hobby, but the community isn't friendly to a lot of people right now. And I think that we can change that. And I want to say that if you are a wargamer, like Joe said, it's our job to make things more inclusive. It's our job to educate, and it's our job to call out injustice and bigotry when we see it. And we are seeing a lot of it.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful point to end on. This is our hobby, and it's ours to make open and available to those who want to experience it.
Take that, Nazis.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that probably will do it for us here today. I think we've pretty much exhausted this topic. If you're a Nazi and you want to argue with me, save yourself the time and I don't care what you have to
No,
say.
no, no, metrics, please do. Yell in the comments, upvote, downvote, go for it. I'll respond to each and every one of you.
I will respond to you if you are a Nazi if you gave this episode a 5-star review. I will engage you in dialogue if you rate this episode up. If you do not, I will not engage you in dialogue. Sorry. them's the breaks.
But seriously, though, people who do want to comment on the things we talked about, offer their opinion on the way we've dealt with this, on the topics we've dealt with, please feel free to engage in the podcast space, in the YouTube space, call us up on Twitter. And if it's in good faith, of course, we are more than willing to talk to you about any and all topics we've covered here.
Yeah, definitely. We always love reading the comments we get on things. The feedback has been good. We've already adjusted a few things to make our episodes better from what we've been told. And I think that we want to continue to improve what we're doing. And so, as Joe mentioned, you can find us at YouTube, on various podcast places, and on Twitter. If you want to talk to us on Twitter, I am at Jack_Trumbull. That's TRUMBULL. And Joe is at Joe Fonseca Hist. That is JoeFonsecahist. Nailed it.
Perfect.
And you can talk to us there. Please, if you enjoyed what we do, leave us a rate, leave us a comment. And if you don't enjoy it, sorry, I don't know what to tell you there.
You already sunk 2 hours into us. There's no going back.
Sorry?
You've already sunk 2 hours into us. There's no coming back from that.
We're only an hour and a little bit in. We're probably going to trim this down, but it'll probably be about an hour and 15's worth of us talking about why Nazis are bad.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a strong way to start the series. Before we finally close out here today, I also want to give a brief shout out to Lions Led by Donkeys. It's another podcast that I listen to. They actually recently also did an episode on the Clean Wehrmacht, and it's very funny that we're covering this topic now. But if you want to know more about the Clean Wehrmacht theory, I would recommend going over and listening to their episode on it. It's a pretty nice and casual listening experience. They're not going to throw a ton of academic sources in your face and make it difficult to listen to. So if you want to know more about it, I would say go over there and check them out if you enjoy podcasts.
If we're doing that, also military history visualized and military aviation history visualized have both done a Clean Wehrmacht myth or Wehrmacht war crimes episode and Luftwaffe war crimes episode. So check those out.
Yeah, that's right. None of them were okay. Remember that. All right. Well, from both of us here at Let's Talk About Wargaming, did I get the name of the podcast wrong? I think I did.
Let's talk about
from both of us here. Well, do you have any last thoughts to share before I sign us off here?
Go for it.
All right. Well, thank you for listening to us here today. And from both of us here at Let's Talk About Wargames podcast, thank you, and we hope you have yourself a wonderful and safe rest of your day. See you later.
Bye, everybody.